She was the matriarch of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, a queen, an empress, a symbol of unshakable strength and stern morality. Her very name defined an era of progress, power, and prestige. But concealed behind the public facade of Queen Victoria, hidden within the pages of her private diaries, was a story of profound and lifelong suffering. This was a woman engaged in a constant, secret war, not against foreign powers, but against the enemies within her own mind and body. Crippling depression, chronic physical pain, and a genetic flaw that would haunt Europe's royal houses for generations. These were the battles Queen Victoria fought when no one was watching, the secrets that threatened not only her own stability, but the very foundations of the British monarchy. To understand the woman, we must first understand the girl. Born Alexandria Victoria in the quiet seclusion of Kensington Palace, her path to the throne was anything but certain. Following a succession crisis, her father, the Duke of Kent, married with the express purpose of producing an heir. He succeeded, but died when Victoria was less than a year old, leaving the young princess in the care of her German-speaking mother, the Duchess of Kent. This should have been a childhood of royal privilege. Instead, it became a gilded prison. The Duchess, deeply reliant on her ambitious and manipulative comptroller Sir John Conroy, implemented a brutal set of rules they called the Kensington system. It was a program of psychological control designed with one goal: to render the future queen weak and utterly dependent on them, so that when she took the throne, they would be the power behind it. Imagine a life with no privacy. Victoria was never allowed to be alone, not for a single moment. She slept in her mother's bedroom every night until the day she became queen. She was forbidden from walking down a flight of stairs without holding an adult's hand. Her every action was monitored and recorded in a behavior book. Isolated from other children, her only companions were her half-sister and Conroy's own daughter. It was a childhood of suffocating surveillance, designed to break her spirit. Conroy believed the system would protect her from the corrupting influence of the court and present her to the nation as a pure, untainted monarch. But the system had the opposite of its intended effect. It did not make Victoria weak. It forged her will into steel. She grew to despise Conroy and resent her mother's complicity. This lonely, oppressive upbringing left deep psychological scars. It instilled in her a profound yearning for escape and a desperate need for genuine emotional connection, a need that would define her entire life. When her uncle, King William IV, died on June 20, 1837, the 18-year-old Victoria was awoken in the early hours at Kensington Palace. She was now queen. Her very first commands were to be given an hour alone and to have her bed moved out of her mother's room. Freedom at last. She had survived the gilded cage, but the patterns carved in her youth, the deep-seated anxiety and a predisposition to melancholy, were now etched into the character of the most powerful woman in the world. In 1840, Victoria found the emotional anchor she had always craved. She married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Theirs was a genuine, passionate love match. Her diary entries sing with adoration. After their wedding, she wrote of feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before. He was her everything, her advisor, her partner, her intellectual equal, and her emotional bedrock. For the first time, the lonely girl from Kensington felt safe. But this newfound happiness came with what she called the shadow side of marriage, pregnancy and childbirth. In an era that romanticized motherhood, Victoria's private feelings were shockingly subversive. Just weeks after her wedding, she found herself pregnant and was furious, writing that it was spoiling my happiness. She detested the physical experience, describing it in letters as being like a dog or a cow. She found newborn babies ugly and was disgusted by the idea of breastfeeding. Her aversion was rooted in genuine physical and mental suffering. Over the next 17 years, Victoria would endure 9 pregnancies, each one took a tremendous toll. Not only did it remove her from the state duties she relished, forcing her to cede power to Albert, but it also plunged her into deep depressions. After the birth of her second child, Bertie, in 1841, she suffered what would now be clearly identified as severe postpartum depression. She felt desperately low after a painful labor, and later confessed to Albert that she feared she was losing her mind, seeing visions and hearing sounds. In the Victorian era, there was no name for what she was experiencing. Melancholy was often seen as a moral failing or a simple disorder of the nerves. Albert, a man of his time, struggled to comprehend her struggles, often chiding her for what he saw as a lack of self-control. Victoria, however, came to understand the cyclical nature of her illness. She later warned her eldest daughter to expect lowness and a tendency to cry. "It is what every lady suffers with, more or less, and what I, during my first 2 confinements, suffered dreadfully with." Her struggle was also a quiet rebellion. For the birth of her 8th child, Leopold, in 1853, Victoria embraced a new and controversial anesthetic, chloroform. Its use in childbirth was decried by some in the clergy as a defiance of the biblical directive that women should bring forth children in sorrow, and some doctors also considered it dangerous. But Victoria, having endured so much suffering, championed the medical innovation that would ease the pain of countless women who came after her. It was a private battle with a very public impact, demonstrating her willingness to defy convention to find relief from the pain that defined her experience of motherhood. Victoria's legacy to her children was not just the throne of England. She unknowingly passed down something far more sinister, a secret hidden in her very blood. It was a genetic flaw that would earn the grim moniker, the royal disease, hemophilia. Hemophilia is a rare genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. A minor cut can become a life-threatening event. A simple bruise can lead to severe internal bleeding and excruciating joint pain. The gene is carried on the X chromosome, meaning it is passed down by mothers, who are typically asymptomatic carriers, to their sons, who suffer the devastating effects. There was no known history of the disease in her ancestors, which suggests the mutation most likely arose spontaneously in her generation. Victoria was a carrier. The tragedy of this inheritance became clear with her 8th child, Prince Leopold. From his earliest days, Leopold was a delicate and sickly child. He was bright and intelligent, but his life was a constant negotiation with pain and the ever-present threat of a fatal bleed. Victoria, racked with guilt and terror, became fiercely overprotective, attempting to shield him from any possible harm. Leopold, however, chafed under the restrictions. He longed for a life of purpose beyond the confines of his illness, studying at Oxford and yearning for the independence his siblings took for granted. He saw marriage as his only escape from his mother's suffocating concern. In 1882, he married Princess Helen of Waldeck and Pyrmont, and for a brief time, happiness seemed possible. But the curse was always lurking. In February 1884, on his doctor's advice, Leopold traveled to the warmer climate of Cannes to seek relief from chronic joint pain. On March 27th, inside his residence, the Villa Nevada, he slipped and fell, injuring his knee and hitting his head. It was a minor accident, one that most people would have easily recovered from. For Leopold, it was a death sentence. He died in the early hours of the next morning from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was only 30 years old. Victoria was devastated. To lose another dear child, far from me, and one who was so gifted and such a help to me is too dreadful, she lamented. Leopold's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a dynastic one. The hemophilia gene, passed from Victoria through her daughters, spread across the royal houses of Europe, afflicting the families of Spain and Russia. While not a direct cause of the Russian Revolution, the disease in Tsarevich Alexei fueled the imperial family's reliance on the mystic Rasputin, which contributed to the political instability that preceded the monarchy's collapse. The private genetic flaw of one woman became an invisible, destructive force on the world stage. For 21 years, Prince Albert had been more than a husband. He had been the center of Victoria's universe. He was her chief political advisor, her private secretary, and the organizing force of her life. She wrote that she leaned on him for all and everything, without whom I did nothing, moved not a finger. He was, in effect, the king in all but name, and Victoria's dependence on him was absolute. In late 1861, Albert, exhausted from overwork, fell ill with what was soon diagnosed as typhoid fever. For weeks, he lay sick at Windsor Castle. Victoria remained in a state of denial, unable to comprehend that her invincible Albert could be in mortal danger. On December 14, 1861, Prince Albert died. He was only 42 years old. Victoria's world collapsed. Her grief was not just profound, it was all-consuming. "My life as a happy person is ended," she wailed in a letter. "The world is gone for me." Her mourning was not a quiet private affair. It became a public spectacle and a defining feature of the rest of her reign. She famously wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life, becoming the widow of Windsor. But her grief went far beyond her wardrobe. It was a pathological obsession. She descended into a deep depression, describing paroxysms of despair and yearning and longing. The royal palaces became shrines to her dead husband. His rooms were maintained exactly as they had been when he was alive. Every morning, servants brought hot water to his dressing room. Every night, his clothes were laid out on his bed. She slept with a plaster cast of his hand by her side. This was not just mourning, it was a desperate attempt to deny the reality of her loss. This extreme grief was compounded by a cruel, irrational anger. She blamed her eldest son Bertie for Albert's death, believing the stress of dealing with his romantic scandal had fatally weakened his father. "It quite irritates me to see him in the room," she told a confidant. Most critically for the nation, the Queen vanished. She retreated from public life, secluding herself in Windsor Castle, her seaside home at Osborne, or her remote Scottish estate, Balmoral. For years, she refused almost all public duties. She would not open Parliament. She would not appear in London. The throne of the world's greatest empire was, for all intents and purposes, empty. The public's initial sympathy curdled into frustration, and then Republican sentiment, long dormant, began to stir. The crisis of Queen Victoria's secret illness, her profound paralytic depression, had become a constitutional crisis, threatening the very existence of the institution she was born to lead. With the Queen in hiding, a ghost haunting her own palaces, the tide of public opinion turned against the crown. The 1860s and early 1870s saw the rise of a powerful Republican movement in Britain. Newspapers openly questioned the expense of a royal family whose head was never seen. The Queen's stubborn, grief-stricken seclusion was providing the enemies of the monarchy with their greatest weapon. Her ministers begged her to return to public life, but she remained obstinate. Her retreat was not just emotional, it was a political dereliction of duty. However, even in her seclusion, she clung fiercely to her political role, attempting to govern from the shadows, according to what she believed Albert would have wanted. What finally coaxed her out of the deepest shadows was not a sense of duty, but a need for human connection. She found comfort in the plain-speaking company of a Scottish servant from Balmoral, John Brown. In the years after Albert's death, he became her confidant and her most trusted friend. He spoke to her without the deference of the court, treating her not as a queen, but as a woman. Their relationship was scandalous. The household staff whispered, calling her Mrs. Brown, and her children resented his influence. But for the lonely, grieving queen, Brown provided a link to the world, a strong arm to lean on. After Brown's death in 1883, Victoria was once again plunged into grief. The void was later filled by another controversial figure, an Indian servant named Abdul Karim. He arrived as a gift from India for her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and quickly became her munshi, or teacher, instructing her in Urdu and educating her on Indian affairs. She showered him with titles and he became her constant companion, much to the horror of her racist and class-conscious court. These relationships, while scandalous to her family, were a lifeline for Victoria, a way of coping with the profound isolation that had defined her life since Albert's death. In her final decades, physical ailments mounted. She suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, which caused chronic pain and limited her mobility. Her eyesight began to fail. By the turn of the century, the once vibrant queen was a frail, elderly woman in constant discomfort, ruled by her aches and her memories. She had outlived her husband, 3 of her children, and many of her closest confidants. Her personal struggles had inadvertently reshaped the monarchy. Her long withdrawal had forced a transfer of power from the sovereign to parliament, accelerating the monarchy's transition from a center of political power to a symbolic institution. By the time of her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, her popularity had recovered, transforming her into a beloved, almost mythical figure. The grandmother of Europe and the matriarch of the empire, the public saw the symbol of stability, but the woman herself remained a figure of private sorrow. Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81. Her reign, the longest in British history at the time, had overseen unprecedented industrial, social, and imperial expansion. She left behind a world transformed. But her personal diaries and letters reveal a different legacy, a story not of imperial grandeur, but of human fragility. Beneath the crown and the black mourning dress was a woman who battled severe depression in an age that had no name for it, who endured the agonies of childbirth while detesting the role of mother, and who carried a genetic curse that brought tragedy to her own family and to the royal houses of Europe. She was a queen defined by loss, a ruler whose most significant political crisis was born from her own paralyzing grief. Her life was a profound contradiction, a public image of unbending strength masking a private reality of immense pain. The secret illnesses of Queen Victoria did not ultimately bring down the monarchy, but they shaped it, challenged it, and revealed the hidden, human cost of wearing the crown. Her story is a powerful reminder that even those who seem to be masters of the world are often fighting desperate, silent battles of their own.